Het is zondag 2 september en dit is Links Hobby's, podcast van Authentiek Links. Vandaag beginnen we met onze reeks aan interviews van de Communist University in Londen, met een interview met Peter Moody van New Jersey en Miah van Werf van Minnesota. Beide zijn lid van de Democratic Socialists of America. All right, then let's start this. So I'm doing an interview with two comrades from the US at the Communist University in London. So let's start with the beginning. So who the hell are you?
I'm Miah van Werf, a member of DSA in the United States, Democratic Socialists of America.
That's awesome.
I am Peter Moody, also a member of DSA, and within DSA, I participate in the Democratic Socialists of America Refoundation Caucus. I'm also a very occasional contributor to a podcast called Swampside Chats, and am part of a burgeoning publication, which we're hoping to launch fairly soon, called Cosmonaut.
Oh, that's you're quite politically active then for quite a few years. Or how long have you been a Marxist?
I've considered myself a socialist of some sort or another for about 17 years at this point. I've started getting into organized politics in about 2005. So my semi-serious political life, as it were, has been for a little over a decade.
All right. So let's start with the political organization overall in the US. I mean, the US is quite large. It's the size of Europe, basically. I mean, most listeners have heard about Bernie Sanders running. That's now hitting 2 years. So how have things been developing? If you look at, well, we've seen lots of tweets from Trump. So could you sketch out the political situation right now in the US? I don't know who wants to.
Sure. Right now we're in the situation of political discussion, at least, starting to be dominated by the upcoming midterm elections, as we call them. The United States has regular elections every 2 years for the lower house of Congress, for the entirety of the chamber, and 1/3 of the seats of the United States Senate. So with this consistent, with this very consistent, very regular election schedule, it means that to some degree the major parties are almost always in campaign mode. But at least in terms of how people are talking about what the government is doing and what the Democrats are doing in response, is at least consistently being framed more and more in terms of the elections that are coming up this November. This will pretty much only increase as we get closer to the date.
All right. So that means a lot, of course, also for activity in the Democratic Socialists, I suppose. The DSA has run a independent candidate on a socialist ticket quite recently. What can you tell me about her?
So there's the most well-known of these candidates is a woman by the name of Alexandria OcasioCortez, is a native of either the Bronx or Queens. I forget exactly, but one of the boroughs of New York City. And so she has run as a Democratic Socialist on the Democratic Party ballot line in their primary. So the mechanism by which the Democrat and Republican parties choose their candidates are through these essentially pre-elections called primaries. And she managed to win that race, unseating believe, at least a 10-term incumbent, so someone who's been around in the House of Representatives for certainly the better part of 2 decades at this point. And based on the specific dynamics in her district, she's pretty much guaranteed to win the seat in November.
That's very interesting. I mean, that is showing a lot of potential in the development of the DSA. So, what can you tell us about how the DSA has been developing the past 2 years since the Sanders campaign?
Well, the DSA, for most of its existence, has been a relatively small organization, large by the terms of the American left, but we're talking about 5,000 or so people by an optimistic estimate. In the aftermath of the Sanders campaign, they reached around 25,000 members. Rather recently, they've added basically 25,000 more with the Alexandria OcasioCortez campaign. She's been getting such heavy media presence. They were even talking about the shade of lipstick she wore. Like, you can't buy that kind of media coverage. Now, the internal structures, it's a very decentralized organization. It is not like any party in Europe. It's very much a party in the style of the 18th, 19th century, decentralized clubs, organizations centered around an elected politician here and there, and so on and so forth. So it's, very loose organization.
And very loose, you're now talking about the DSA or the Democrats in general? Or?
Oh, both. Like, more so with the Democrats, but the DSA is modeled to some extent off of the Democrats. A bit more centralized, but not by much.
So it's not quite the membership organization that we know in Europe, where you are a party member, you card-carrying member. In the States, you have these, big organizations, wide organizations that you can just register to, I believe.
Yes, when you sign up to vote, you have to fill out paperwork and you check a box whether you want to be a Democrat or a Republican or sometimes a Libertarian or Green, depending on what state you're in, and then you're allowed to vote in their primaries.
Right, so that gives you the eligibility to vote. All right. So the DSA has increased tenfold in the last few years. That's quite huge. What do you see happening for the future? If you look into the future, another 5 years, do we see another tenfold happening, or?
So, I think one of the ways that DSA has attracted new members has largely been through the positive, the positive, or even sometimes the negative press they get from the candidates that they have supported. So while the DSA leadership, I think, does overstate this somewhat, it is definitely true that the thing that started to kick off DSA's large increase in membership was the Sanders campaign in 2016. The success of OcasioCortez this year has given them a similar boost, even a boost nationally in terms of members coming from all over the country, even though her campaign specifically is limited to a section of New York City. So I think insofar as they can continue to find candidates who present well enough publicly to give a good message to their conception of democratic socialism, I think they will continue to. They'll continue to gain more members. The question is, and I think that the key thing to look for will be what happens, as is almost guaranteed to be the case with Ocasio-Cortez, is that how will her actions once elected affect this? How will that make people looking to DSA in the future, even if we continue to get new crops of candidates who come to DSA as part of shoring up their left credentials, in a sense. How will the actions of Ocasio-Cortez and some of the other people that they've either endorsed or who are actually DSA members who are running for office, once they win, how will they act in Congress, and how will that affect people's perceptions towards DSA in the future? That, I think, is the main unknown quantity at this point. Because while DSA has had members, people who have been card-carrying members of DSA in Congress previously, the media attention on them has been much lower. So in that sense, we are in a different situation than the organization was 10, 20 years ago.
Right. So if I make a crude comparison, given that the population of the United States is about 20 times that of the Netherlands, I would say that transplanted to the Netherlands, DSA would be an organization of about 2,500 members. So basically, in absolute terms, it is about the same kind of size as the Socialist Party in the Netherlands, which has 38,000 members right now. But in relative terms, it is much smaller. So how would you characterize DSA in a historical perspective, in a wider perspective? How big is it really?
So in terms of the socialist organizations that have existed over the course of the history of the U.S., DSA comes in at about the third or fourth largest. So the largest was probably the old Socialist Party of America in the late teens, early 20s, where it got somewhere up to 120,000 members, and was able to rack up respectable votes in a number of states, and on a federal level was also able to elect members of Congress, and so on. So if that was 100 years ago, the population was maybe half of what it is now in the U.S. The Communist Party in the 1930s also reached similar heights. Its profile was a little bit different. It had greater implantation in the newly developing industrial union movement and in some of the more cultural program aspects of the New Deal. And the Communist Party also had much better implantation in the black working class in the U.S., which is, for obvious reasons, historically a very important part of the U.S. population generally, because of its unique history with being brought over as slaves, and then currently still existing as a further exploited and discriminated against section of the U.S. population. And then the industrial workers of the world, which was never a party, and people could maybe argue whether or not it was socialist exactly, because it organized as a radical trade union, but it also probably had somewhere in the range of 100,000 members at its height. But these organizations we're talking about 80, almost 90 years ago at this point, in terms of the last time we had significant organizations of even larger size, even in terms of comparable size. Most left organizations haven't had that membership size, and certainly haven't had that level of implantation in broader society basically since the end of World War II.
Well, I would like to throw in that the Communist Party, while not primarily an electoral party, they did have a series of elected people, most notably on the New York City Council, and also a Democrat during the period of the Popular Front, the Second Popular Front during World War II, I should emphasize.
All right. So it is, for American terms, it is quite a big organization then. Okay, so How does that relate to different organizations in the American left? If you look at, for example, the American CWI or the American ISO, which is related to the International Socialists in the Netherlands, if you look at those kind of organizations which have been existing also for decades by now, how big are they? Do they have an impact at all? Are they relating themselves to the DSA?
So for the most part, the relationship between other organizations on the American left and DSA has been ex-members of the other organizations coming towards DSA in some form or another. To touch on the two examples specifically that you mentioned, excuse me, the American section of the CWI, called Socialist Alternative, which I believe is called something similar in the Netherlands, is, at least historically, has been very strong in certain areas, but has basically existed as, in some sense, a regional organization in those areas in which they were strong. So they have a elected city councilor in Seattle, which is one of the major cities in the Pacific Northwest, and they were fairly instrumental in getting a $15 an hour minimum wage passed in that city and in some other surrounding cities to Seattle. They were also successful in getting a similar measure passed in Minneapolis, which is a major city in the upper Midwest. They've run candidates there as well. None have been successful as of yet. So, say Seattle, Minneapolis, and to a lesser degree Boston in the Northeast have been their main strongholds, but they haven't been able to expand nationally as well as DSA is able to currently. They attempted to after the election of their city councilor in Seattle, Shama Sawant, but they actually ended up drawing into the Bernie Sanders campaign as well, in addition to DSA. The trouble I think that they had was that up until that point, the Socialist Alternative had been promoting a line of, we need a new party, we need to break with the Democrats, build a new workers' party, a party of the 99%. The specific slogan has changed somewhat depending on the mood of the moment. But with the Sanders campaign, they tried to do something very, very cagey in a way of wanting to support Sanders without supporting Sanders. Basically saying that this is a good thing, people should get involved, but without actually saying that people should do what they need to do to vote for him, which is to register as a Democrat in order to cast their votes for him. This is something that, going back to DSA, because of their historical strategy of working within the Democratic Party, they were able to do much more easily. And it worked out for them much better, which I think has ended up leading many people who came into Socialist Alternative enthusiastic from Shama Sawant and their successful minimum wage work to actually leaving Socialist Alternative and joining DSA, because they're doing what Socialist Alternative wants to do. They're more honest about it, even though both organizations are putting forward reformist politics, but DSA is much more honest about its reformist politics, and there are fewer contradictions for people to wrestle with inside their heads. So it's a somewhat of an easier political sell, I think. As far as the International Socialist Organization, it has been trying to engage with DSA members, largely from the outside. There are also a number of ex-ISO members who have since joined DSA at various levels. Something that I have noticed is that the ex-Socialist Alternative members tend to be on the center to the right of DSA, whereas the ex-ISO members tend to be more on the left. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but that's...
Could you give some examples of that? What does left-right mean here?
So, yeah, sure. So the right wing of DSA are people who are pretty much adherents of the old strategy of the organization, which historically has been the idea of working within the Democratic Party and the social movements broadly aligned with the Democratic Party to either push it to the left in general, or in the most ambitious form of the strategy to, as they say, realign it to become something like something like what the European social democratic parties used to be in the 60s and 70s. The center within DSA right now, which I'd say is largely in control of the organization in partial alliance with the right, are people who put forward the idea of an independent party that is independent of the Democrats and is, again, trying to cohere something like something that in other countries would be an independent party, the left, but still kind of uses the Democratic Party to get its candidates on the ballot, with some at this point very hypothetical measures in place to keep those candidates accountable to the organization that is running them. And the DSA left is in general much more critical. They're still for the building of an independent socialist party, but are much more critical of using the Democratic Party ballot line even tactically. They're generally for the idea of a very sharp break with the Democrats and running independently essentially from the start. Even within the left, there's still shades of people thinking, well, maybe we can use the Democratic Party ballot line tactically. I think part of this is mostly due to the fact that what is now the DSA left and what is now the DSA center basically used to be united in the DSA as the DSA left 3-4 years ago. But with the way things have developed since then, both in the organization exploding in size and in terms of just differences coming up within that old tendency, that there has been this new split into two different tendencies within the broader organization.
Okay, Miah, I believe that you were a member of the ISO. So why did you switch from the ISO to the DSA? Were you a long member of the ISO, or?
I was a member for several years in the Deep South, not exactly the easiest place to organize in the United States. In all honesty, I got tired of sect politics, these politics of you have to agree with everything or you're out. And the DSA, with all of the criticisms you can make, it's not that. And you can find a lot of ex-ISO members, especially in the South of all places, that have joined up with the DSA in recent times. It's honestly quite impressive how much of the old left has been reignited, re-sparked, re-radicalized, and rejoined into our movement.
Okay, so when we zoom out a little and look at the wider workers' movements, a few years ago we had the $15 per hour campaign. I believe that the federal wage is very low, like half of it or even less, or it was. And in quite a few cities, Seattle was already mentioned, $15 is now the new minimum wage. So that was carried, among others, by the CWI, but also by the trade union movement. So how has the trade union movement been developing? I mean, are there campaigns running, or what would you like to say about that?
So I guess about the $15 an hour movement in general is that it hasn't been like a lot of campaigns in the U.S. Of left-wing organizations, is that they generally don't have long-term staying power. Partially because the way they're run, I think, often leads to burnout among leading activists, and because, at least up until this point, the left, broadly speaking, has been quite small. It's difficult. It's difficult to build up significant strength over a long period of time to counteract the effects of burnout. I think also in the case of the $15 an hour movement specifically, in some sense, its success has been its own undoing in the place where it has been successful, in that now that the $15 hour minimum wage has been won, if there wasn't an attempt to make a connection towards other or broader political issues, then it's very easy to say, okay, we've won, now we can go home. Add on to that is just the general short-termist perspective that a lot of these organizations have, is that it's the focus is very much on these individual campaigns without developing a broader political perspective. They still have a broader political perspective, but you have to dig through several layers in some sense to find out what it is, particularly in terms of the public-facing organizations that they put forward for $15 an hour minimum wage, for rent control has been something that's come up in some cities as well. This, I think, might be starting to change somewhat, in that there are people at least starting to think in a longer term view, but right now at least it's in terms of how exactly that will turn out, it's in some sense still too early to tell.
And just to have a picture about $15 an hour, how realistic is that to live on, really?
It depends on your various locations. In Seattle, it adds up to about $600 a month. I think that's about 400 or 500 euros. But in a city like Seattle, you could easily spend $1,000 a month on rent. So you're not going to get rich on $15 an hour, but it does represent a doubling. The federal minimum wage currently is $7.25, if I remember correctly. It's a pittance.
And that hasn't been changing for decades, I believe.
I believe the last time it changed was in 91 or the early 90s. The states also have their own minimum wages. So like in Florida, it's $8.25 and pegged to inflation. Right. So there is some adjustment over time. But for most of America, they haven't gotten a raise in 2 decades.
All right. Now, I believe that, both of you are Marxists, of course. You've been coming all the way to London, many miles from home. So what drives you as Marxists in a movement like the DSA? What do you want to achieve in the DSA for the next period?
So is one of the things that drives me within the broader organizations is that in the U.S. context, the fact that we have large numbers of people drawing themselves to an organization that has some conception of socialism, even though its stated conception of socialism really doesn't go too much beyond a strengthened welfare state and some vague conception of broader social control from below, that's still a significant development. And it seems like that this indicates an opportunity to actually bring the politics of Marxism back into wider segments of the population. So one of the things that the U.S. left has been trying to deal with is that there was essentially a conscious campaign in the first decade after World War II to unlink socialist politics from the workers' movement. In that there was a concerted effort to push mainly Communist Party members, but other socialists and communists out of the labor unions, and basically smash their organizations. The organizations themselves weren't smashed, but except in some circumstances, the link between socialism and the broader workers' movement has been heavily attenuated, if not completely detached. And even now, with the people that are joining DSA, many of them aren't. Certainly, they're not. They don't come from segments of the population that people would necessarily think of as working class. I think in many respects they still are, just because of the way that the dynamics of the working class have changed significantly in the United States and globally over the past 40 years. So it is more people coming from the service sector, from the very broadly defined technology sector, and segments. A lot of teachers and other education workers, people whose professions have been increasingly de-skilled and essentially proletarianized over the course of the past few decades. And so these are people. This gives a kind of a broad sense of some of the people who are coming towards DSA, and it seems like there's a potential there for if they can get more active, not only as socialists but also as people who conceive of themselves in some fashion as workers, and as conscious of their own position as workers, both negatively in the sense that they're people who work for a wage or for a salary, don't have that much control over their own working lives, and conceive of themselves as workers positively in the sense that they're people who have the ability to organize, both to defend their own immediate interests and to project themselves as, through their ability to organize, as potential leaders within the socialist movement. Then I think we can try and rebuild that link between socialist politics and the workers' movement more broadly. And I think while DSA it's still a very weak vehicle at this point, right now it's the vehicle that people are moving to. So from the perspective of us as Marxists, attempting, it's in our interest and in some sense our duty to attempt to use that as a vehicle to help rebuild that link.
For the last few decades, to be a Marxist in the United States has been to be lost. As Peter pointed out, we've been systematically separated from our working class base. The merger theory, the theory of the unity of the socialism and the workers' movement, it's not really a fact here. Unlike in Europe, you have still maintained that link throughout the decades. However strenuous it has become, as Peter said, we do not have it. But for the first time in several decades, we have an idea of what to do next. We have a vehicle that we can get that message out, and we have a chance to actually build a working class party, the first one in damn near a century.
Well, I would say thank you for your time. Should people like to look you up, where can people find you?
So I guess to plug our organizations, the website of Democratic Socialists of America broadly is www.dsausa.org. The website of the Refoundation Caucus, which is one of several tendencies in DSA, again, the generally broad left tendency, is dsarefoundation.org.
Dat was hem weer voor deze week. Volgende week publiceren we het interview met Peter Moody over de politieke ontwikkelingen in Zuid-Afrika en met name ook de Zuid-Afrikaanse Communistische Partij. Wil je nou niet wachten totdat we alle interviews hebben gepubliceerd? Kijk dan even op onze donatiepagina hoe jij direct toegang kunt krijgen tot een privéfeed, zodat je niet hoeft te wachten. Dergelijke financiële steun helpt ons om de podcast verder te ontwikkelen. Ga naar linkshobbies.nl/doneren. En voor de rest, tot volgende week.